Honestly, yeah, I just sort of like decided to merge the two words because I kept saying predator pastor, and I'm like, you know what, this kind of just works. And it's a terrible thing to have to create, but I do know that language matters, and those Preda-Pastors are good at language. If there's anything I know, it's that language, it's all in the language. Even the values of the church, things like contagious joy with smiling faces on the wall, which meant no lament, no complaining, don't tell me about the abuse. We couldn't even use the phrase burnout. And so I feel like as we are trying to raise awareness about this playbook that apparently they all somehow have and use, gives us the ability to see what is hard for our brains to see. But I want to do my best to give language to people to help them see how to get out, because it's really hard. But no one should have to stay in an abusive environment like that with these Preda-Pastors.
Welcome to the Liminal Living podcast, where we have conversations around the liminal spaces of dark nights and deconstructions. And we're hoping to give you hospitable spaces with these conversations so that you can understand your own faith journey a little bit better. And these conversations, I curate them, so I call myself the curator of conversations. That's me, Dr. Tom Rundell, also known as Tom. And today, the conversation that I've curated is Jason and Lori Adams Brown. Now, this was my first time interviewing more than one person at one time, so it was fun to have that dynamic in here. And I met Jason and Lori in Puerto Rico. Well, I met Jason before that online because he was a pastor in the Caneo cohort that I was leading through the Caneo Retreat Center run by Dan and Tanya White out of Puerto Rico. And him and his wife both were in that program. And so it all concluded with a retreat, and that's where I met them. And they're just a power-packed couple. Lori's a business and nonprofit executive. She's an inclusivity specialist. She's got like 30 years experience living and working abroad in Central and South America and Asia. Right now they're in the San Francisco Bay Area. She speaks 6 languages. She's got a master's in intercultural studies, a bachelor's in sociology and Spanish. And what she does is she takes teams from good to great through relationship building and intentional diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging strategies. She also runs a podcast called The World of Difference, and they hold discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's a good podcast. Go check it out. Jason holds a master's in intercultural studies and a master's in marriage and family therapy. He's currently the director of missionary support and a trauma specialist with Global Gates. And he does some soul care work with some folks and hosting trauma processing weekends. He grew up in India and Thailand as a missionary kid. And both Jason and Lori served as missionaries in Indonesia and Singapore with the Southern Baptist IMB missionary wing. And we talk about how that became a real hostile place during the Conservative Resurgence that I spoke of in my Why I Left Evangelicalism solo episode a few weeks back. Jason and Lori's story is interesting. They were on staff at a place called Echo Church in California under the leadership of Pastor Andy Wood, who now pastors Saddleback Church in place of Rick Warren, who was pretty much America's pastor for a while there, presiding over, praying over Barack Obama, President Obama. And under Andy's leadership, they experienced spiritual, emotional, and financial abuse at Echo Church. We don't really go into the details of that story because they've talked about that quite a bit already in other places. We instead go into the environment of abuse in church and why it's so hard for congregants to identify abusive leaders even after one might be convicted of a crime. And specifically, we get into a very helpful social media post that Lori wrote this past week about a conversation she had with a congregant she knew at a former church whose pastor was convicted of 35 counts of assault. And this congregant was spouting the narratives that protected the pastor and ignored the victims. So we just talk really honestly about the narratives that communities believe in, how they're created, why they're defended after such a man is exposed. And I hope this conversation gives you like a Google Translate version of the gaslighting Christian language that can be used to prop up and cover up pastors and leaders who have done harm, so that you can better see through the haze of narrative to what is really going on. So I think this is my longest introduction ever on record for this podcast, but I needed to kind of give you just a good front porch for this conversation with Jason and Lori Adams. All right, well, Jason and Lori Adams Brown, welcome to the Liminal Living podcast.
Awesome. It's good to be here, man. Always good to see Tom Rundle, man.
Thanks for having us. We're excited to be here.
Now you got to share a mic. So this is my first time interviewing like two people at the same time. And so you'll have to be patient with me. And so you're like going to be dodging and ducking and weaving. Hopefully your heads don't hit while you're trying to say something on the same microphone. But
I'm just hoping she doesn't hit me during the episode if I say something that she doesn't like. Or
I'm actually waiting for that moment. So
it's like you just watch her backhand me. Don't say that.
It's like, guys, I just saw it. It just happened. We're not capturing the video. But so we met through the Caneo Institute, and that would be the center that Dan and Tanya White run down in Puerto Rico. And Jason, you were in the men's group over there, and I was facilitator there. Laura, you were in the women's group, and we finally did meet in Puerto Rico. Do you have a memory from Puerto Rico that stands out as being totally funny or fun or memorable? Either of you?
Totally fun, memorable. I mean, the whole experience of Caneo was just like exactly, you know, there's no one thing that helps you that does everything for your healing process, but Caneo, that whole process was just exactly what I needed for those however many weeks, months it was. And then I just remember, you know, showing up in Puerto Rico, this beautiful place, going to the beach. There was a lot of laughter and stuff too, but I'm not thinking it. As soon as I get off this call, I'm like, oh man, I should have shared that story. That was hilarious. But yeah, nothing's coming to mind right now. Lori might think of something.
I mean, maybe not hilarious, but just fun. I liked the times where, you know, both the men and women, all our groups were together and we would go hang out. Like we went to the beach a couple times, different, you know, situations, and just that kind of casual conversation that we were able to have. I think so much richness came out of that. I think when people have stories of trauma, there's a space for a structured processing of it. And that was so helpful. And then equally helpful was just the hangout time over some mojitos on the beach with people who'd been through some similar things.
I remember lots of mojitos, actually. I remember drinking, I drank one of the drinks that Dan made for us on the first night when we played Pictionary as like the icebreaker to get to know each other. And he made me a drink, but I didn't have food before that. And so I was like, hey, this is sugary and fruity. And then all of a sudden I'm like, I can't see the board straight. So it's like, how am I going to draw this? And yeah, I remember being a little more animated than I normally am. So that was Dan's fault. That was totally Dan's fault.
Is that why the girls won?
This explains everything.
Is that your excuse?
That is. I do remember the girls won, but it was so close. It was close.
It was very close. I feel like you were the weak link that night, Tom, to be honest with you.
I think I was. And that was Dan's fault again. It was like the Lions game versus the 49ers. It's just like, we're doing great, and then we choked in the last half. And
no, I'm wearing a 49ers hat right now.
No, that's a Giants hat.
Oh, it's a Giants hat. You're right.
San Francisco, though.
She's like, oh, man, I'm already being corrected. This is not going to go well, Tom. I'm already making mistakes.
That's all right, because this is the Liminal Living podcast, and it's not supposed to be perfect. So
I hate liminal space. I don't know what you're talking about.
It's not supposed to be enjoyable.
No.
That's the point.
That's why we call it liminal. There's other words that can be used for it. But so you guys, you had you've been together, married, and kind of working together in a ministry context for a while. What kind of roots do you have together, working in the ministry context?
Yeah, I mean, both of us, grew up overseas. We're both missionary kids. Lori grew up in Venezuela. I grew up in India and Thailand, mostly Thailand. And our folks were both with the International Mission Board, which is the mission org that was Southern Baptist. And so we had some deep, Southern Baptist roots, but a lot of it was connected to overseas. And so even as we began to watch the Southern Baptist Convention become more and more and more conservative, we always we were kind of always a little bit of outliers in that world, because we were in it, but we also there were certain aspects of it that we were always a little bit different, like with women in ministry, some political stuff. And so, we always would figure out who we could talk to and be a little more open and who we couldn't on some of those things. But yeah, Southern Baptist was a deep part of our roots. We actually met at a Baptist campus ministries retreat. How lame is that? People
so
used to
romantic.
ask how we met, and I would be like, she was a dancer in a bar. I want to come up with a story, and they're just like, my wife just looks like you're an idiot.
Baptist
campus ministries retreat. And then she just wouldn't stop calling me after that. It was super embarrassing, Tom. I basically just caved. I gave in. I was like, all right, look, she's just chasing me down. I feel like I need to give her a chance. And so,
if everyone could just see Lori's face right now, that would be.
Yes, anybody who was at Stanford University back in the mid-90s knows that that's not how that went down. But anyway, we'll let him live his little fantasy of, revisionist history. But yeah, no, we definitely, when we met, we were introduced by my campus minister at Stanford University in Birmingham is a Southern Baptist university. And even though Jason was at Auburn, which is 2 hours away, we had met at this, Baptist campus ministries retreat, and my student minister knew Jason because he had done some summer mission work, and she had done his interviews through the state Baptist convention kind of thing. And so she just felt like we had to meet because we were both missionary kids who'd grown up in the same denomination and mission agency. And I was about to go to Indonesia for the first time, which is really where I felt like, even though I was just 19 at the time, I was just a sophomore, I really just had this plan going forward. That's where I want to live. That's where I want to work.
Dude, Tom, she had it was the weirdest, she was obsessed with Indonesia. It wasn't like, oh, I think I'll do this in the future. It was full on obsession. She had a whole language. She'd never been to Indonesia, but if you had been to Indonesia, you were suddenly cool, in her words. She'd actually use this language all the time. And she would just be she was obsessed with Indonesia for some reason. So the only reason she actually stopped and talked to me is because she found out that I had been to Indonesia, which when I was in high school, I was in a baseball tournament and went to Jakarta. And so that's the only reason she talked to me.
It was Indonesia made you cooler in her eyes.
And I barely made that team. So I feel like it was God ordained, brother. That's.
Now you're getting the accurate history, not so much the revisionist version.
All right. That's good. And you ended up then going over there together, right? And how long did you stay over there?
Yeah, I mean, we after I graduated from college, Jason's a couple years older, so he stayed and worked at, of all places, the Lifeway bookstore in Birmingham, which was not called Lifeway at the time. I think that was just Baptist bookstores back in the day. And then we went to a Southern Baptist seminary together here in California after we got married, and then went straight to Indonesia. So we're as Southern Baptist as they come. Like Jason said, unicorns. We weren't unicorns growing up because I think the conservative takeover known as the Conservative Resurgence, which was led by two men whose both initials are PP, which I don't know, like whatever you want to do with that. Paul Pressler and Paige Patterson led this conservative resurgence. And there's all kinds of stuff that's come out about both of them in recent years, which shows really who they are and who they always have been, which is not good. Mm-hmm. But we were raised in families where the conservative takeover, the conservative resurgence was not seen as a good thing. So there were some of us still around in the Southern Baptist world, and we were kind of products of those families. So I think in the 90s when I was in college, there was some indication that Southern Baptists were making some changes. There was some big apology that happened at the convention in the 90s when I was in college about the slavery issue, which is why the Southern Baptist Convention began and broke off from another Baptist group, the American Baptists. So they did this huge apology that there were signs that they were going to be changing. And once again, being young, early 20s, I just believed that was true, right? I believed so much that was true. I believed a lot of the empty promises, to be honest. So we saw signs that, well, things haven't been great in certain ways, but look, it's getting better and there's people wanting to bring change. So we didn't see anything wrong with going to a Southern Baptist seminary out of all the choices we had, doing a program that was very focused on, linguistics and sociology and culture, which is something we both really love. And then preparing to go overseas and work both, in ministry, but also through some nonprofit work there. We wore many hats in our Indonesia years. But yeah, we stayed in Indonesia 10 years, 10 beautiful and terrible years. Like it's mixed with all the things, because we did tsunami relief during that time, about midway through our 10 years. That's something that's still really hard for us, that we remember every year, December 26th. Good friend of mine that lost her baby. We knew people that we lost. And then we met a lot of people in the aftermath that had lost loved ones because of the work that we did. And it's just, once again, a beautiful, terrible experience. But yeah, 10 solid years in Indonesia together. So yeah.
And then we were 10 years in Singapore after that. So 20 years total with Southern Baptist Mission Org. Yeah, so a lot of deep Southern Baptist roots in all of that, but always, like as Lori said, kind of felt like a unicorn. Always felt like we didn't completely fit in. But man, you're breathing the gas, you're breathing the air that's there for so long. Even some of your own thinking starts to change. You start to kind of dig in, you question whether or not you're right, all that kind of stuff. And so that was there for me. Lori started reading some books when we were in Singapore. So she was always about, a few years ahead of me sometimes in some of the thinking where we're at now, because she was already reading some stuff that was helping her begin to process before we ever left the field.
Yeah, you talked about the conservative resurgence, and I actually did a historical overview in my last solo episode, why I left evangelicalism. And I hit, that's when fundamentalism and evangelicalism started to blend in the largest denomination in the nation. And then you couldn't tell the two apart between fundamentalist belief and evangelical belief. And they became one thing, and it was in this SBC. I'm so glad you gave a little more history on that. When was was there a moment where it was something's not right here in your faith journey that made you start to question some of the water you're in or the air you're breathing? Was there a moment, or was it a slow turning of the ship? Do you remember anything about that doesn't weigh up?
Yeah, there definitely was a moment. Well, I think there's something that kicked it off, but I felt like it still was a slow burn, leading up to where we began to unpack more of some of the foundational stuff that had kept us in Southern Baptist for so long. And I think, a big part of there's just different pieces, right? There's the, obviously the election of Donald Trump, and then watching people that we knew that were typically kind, compassionate, caring people. But when it came suddenly to American politics and Donald Trump, it was like something got attached there to them that was that changed a lot. Well, okay, I didn't even say before Donald Trump, we even saw this over 20 years, because every once in a while we'd have 3 years on the field. We'd come back to the States for 6 months to a year, depending on our stateside assignment. And we just noticed there seemed to be like a correlation between the number of hours someone watched Fox News and how angry and paranoid, hateful they were becoming. Like, and so we were watching these people that we loved and cared about, even family members sometimes, right? And then we're seeing this transformation happening. And so that right there was a part of the that discontentment, that ambivalence about the SBC, this just, the cognitive dissonance, all of that, right? So some of it was that political landscape, which for us, I mean, growing up overseas, like American politics, we're kind of like, I mean, it's America. Like we've never been like, oh, America is the greatest nation on the planet. Like we just never were a part of that. We love being citizens of the world in so many ways because of our growing up overseas and living most of our lives overseas. And so we never had this. It was always confusing to us how much American politics and the American church started to merge. Like, why are we putting the American flag up in the church? Like, I'm just like, it didn't make any sense to me. And thankfully, both Lori and I had parents who were, ahead of us in that. Like my parents left the IMB because of some of the conservative resurgence, all of that. And when he was pastoring a church at one time, part of his process was getting the American flag out of the church, lots of different things like that. So there's several different pieces. There was the watching people change on these politics, Donald Trump. I think then, we probably won't go into a lot of our story, but we have a long, long story of after leaving the field, came and worked at a church that had Baptist ties, but most people wouldn't even know that it had Baptist ties. And then, we went through, this abusive experience with the lead pastor and his executive pastor, confronted them about our concerns, and they fired us and tried to get us to sign NDAs and all of that. And that significantly, like, it's hard to understand how hard that was. Like, it was exhausting. It was, we didn't know if we were gonna have to live under a bridge financially, coming as missionaries to this place, and we're in like a very expensive area. Going through that, there were several things that suddenly, for me personally, I was open to starting to unpack. And as I started to do my own healing process of working in the, going through our cohort, doing my own story work stuff, where I just sat down and began to, listening to Adam Young's podcast, the place we find ourselves in, and looking at what he talks about in story work, working through some of Dan Allender stuff. And as I began to unpack things, I realized how much of my theology was filtered through shame and fear. And I began to realize, like, something's not right here. That if I'm filtering all of my thinking through that, like, so often it's like, if I start thinking about changing this part of my belief or that part of my belief, boy, this fear would come in, or I would just feel this shame of like what others would think. And so, I would say there was a slow burn up to that point. And then it was like, it began to work pretty quickly post being fired from a Baptist church, that finally our jobs weren't tied to, that identity. And it felt like we could begin to really process that.
My experience as a woman in the SBC has that kind of nuance to it. Also a woman with, significant leadership giftings from the Spirit, which we were actually just talking about this yesterday, Jason and I remember back in the IMB time in Singapore, when IMB is the International Mission Board, the Southern Baptist Denominations mission agency that we worked with and grew up in. And just theologically, you can't make a case that the Holy Spirit gifts based on gender. But the reality is, a lot of these, sort of theo bros, I would say, that were colleagues cared for me, saw my gifting. It would be this kind of awkward thing like, oh, we're having strategy meetings and there aren't many women here. And Lori's one of those women that is, comes. And it's like, it was just there was an awkwardness. A lot of these men, I considered brothers. We could have theological conversations, but at the same time, we were remembering yesterday, there's one, and he, he's very revered now because of a position he's in, but he has no theological basis, but it was like, just to say out loud that the Holy Spirit doesn't gift based on gender. He was like, well, but with preaching. And you're like, that's not true. That's not biblical. That's not in the Bible. Like, where did you find that? Right. But it's more just tradition. There's a lot of tradition, and men in that world get the wind at their back the whole way through. So Jason and I, going into the job that we took with International Mission Board in Indonesia early on, we both had the same job title. I had actually more experience in that area than he did. So if anything, I had an upper hand for a couple of reasons. One, I was very involved in the ministry with my parents growing up. So I actually had a lot of ministry experience in that way. And I also spoke some Indonesian because I'd been there a couple of times and had worked with the people on the field that we would be working with. So I had the network, I had the experience, but very quickly it began to be very obvious he getting more just because he's a man, being seen as in a certain way. And then definitely once I had a child, everything changed. People saw me differently. Like, well, you're a mom now, it's almost like, okay. So like, well, he's not going to get homeschooled day one. Right. But even then I wasn't planning on homeschooling him. Right. And so there were just all these messages all along that were sort of chipping away and trying to make me smaller, or it was just awkward at times. I felt like the whole way through, though, with our time there, my whole thing was, as long as I'm allowed to fulfill what I believe is, the purpose, the calling, whatever you want to, however you want to phrase that I'm passionate about, that I believe God has given to me, and use the gifts God has given me to serve and do the work that I want to do. No matter what people believe or don't believe, as long as I can fulfill those things, it doesn't matter what they call me, what my titles are, as long as I can sort of live that out. And I was really, for the most part, able to. But I think one phrase that I'm trying to unpack, I've been through, almost 3 years of therapy now, after being fired, like Jason mentioned, abused. And when I say abused, I know in the SBC, there's a lot of sexual abuse. That was not my experience, but have a lot of compassion for those who are walking through that. And I'm very angry about that on behalf of others. My abuse at the church here, which is Echo Church in the San Francisco Bay Area, it was started by Andy Wood, who now is the pastor at Saddleback, who replaced Rick Warren. And then his executive pastor, they've been friends since high school in Detroit, is Felipe Santos. And the two of them very much psychologically and emotionally and verbally, spiritually, financially abused us and many others on staff over many, many years. And many are covered up by NDAs or fear of speaking out, as you can imagine. But I guess once that experience happened, and I've been through like 3 solid years of therapy and have had a lot of healing, and it's beautiful, terrible as well. But I think now I'm sort of starting to unpack like the story before the story, which is my Southern Baptist life that sort of was a slow burn. So that particular part, I remember at the end of my time in Singapore thinking, I really want to leave Southern Baptist because it's so hard to be a woman with these gifts in this denomination. It wasn't like that when I was a child as much. I felt like it was going to get better. And my utter shock was that it got worse. Women were being told to be more small than before, and more silent than before, more behind the scenes instead of in, front. And so over time, that was really a slow burn. And I think the phrase that kind of led me astray for a long time was nowhere is perfect. And that was something that was thrown around quite a bit, both in Southern Baptist world and in Echo Church. That kept me there for a while, because there are beautiful things, and I would hold on to the beautiful things and those verses that we often quote, like, think about these good things, and so that's where I would set my mind on better things and ignore the bad things. But ignoring the bad things or pushing those aside And I get that our brains don't like cognitive dissonance and we would prefer to think about happy things. That is part of my slow burn. And then in the end, pointing out the abusive situation that we did ended up us being fired, and honestly horrible, still walking through that in many ways. But in situations like that, it's hard to make the decision to leave because your finances are tied to it. Our education was, very Southern Baptist related, and they have a not good, reputation now because of the things that so many of them, the PPs and others, have done. And so going into another denomination, even, it's hard because it's like, oh, do we trust you? You've been Southern Baptist. Going into like a non-Christian environment with that background is especially fraught, as you can imagine here in the Bay Area in particular. So you kind of know either I make this work and it's not great, or I try something that seems impossible to navigate with a new network, with the education that I have. Do I get more education in midlife with children, with 3 teenagers at home? So, I think a lot of people that we worked with in that denomination are probably in that space, that very, very liminal space of it's not great here, but probably worse out there. So let's make this work.
Yeah, I think you hit on something that people in leadership can abuse, and that is like that diversion of attention, almost like, well, yeah, we got all this horrible, abusive, nasty stuff here, but look at all the people over here that are smiling and happy, and, focus on those things. And you recently, you're very active on social media, Lori, and you recently posted, I think, something that was it was gold. It was the top 10 things a Preda-Pastor does to groom the congregation. But then you offer like this Google translation of what the gaslight language is actually trying to say. And where did you, before we get into, I'd like to hit those because I think they're good, but where did you find the term Preda-Pastor, and how would you define that so people can notice like, oh, there's one right there?
Honestly, yeah, I just sort of like decided to merge the two words because I kept saying predator-pastor, and I'm like, you know what, this kind of just works. And it's a terrible thing to have to create, but I do know that language matters, and those Preda-Pastors are good at language. If there's anything I know, it's that language, it's all in the language, all of it. Even the phrase I mentioned, like it's, nothing's perfect, nowhere's perfect. That was language that trapped me for a while. There was a lot of language at Echo Church that, caused me a lot of betrayal blindness as well. And even the values of the church, things like contagious joy with smiling faces on the wall, which meant no lament, no complaining. Don't tell me about the abuse. We couldn't even use the phrase burnout, which it was a burnout culture. So it's all in the language. And Dr. Wade Mullen's book, which I picked up right around the time I was, just had been abused and fired. His book, Something's Not Right, starts with that. Like, it's all in the language, watch the language. And so I feel like as we are trying to raise awareness about this playbook that apparently they all somehow have and use, it's like, how do they all know what to do? That raising awareness of what their playbook is gives us the ability to see what is hard for our brains to see, because I experienced betrayal blindness. I understand the psychology of that. I have a lot of compassion on myself and others that walk through that, but I want to do my best to give language to people to help them see how to get out, because it's really hard. But no one should have to stay in an abusive environment like that with these Preda-Pastors. But yeah, I think I mentioned to somebody the other day, I was in Cincinnati for a work trip last week for the job I do here in Silicon Valley in a tech company, leading a leadership summit there. And I got to meet up with a couple of people that used to be on our team. And we worked with them in Malaysia and Singapore, and they're, also out, no longer Southern Baptist. And we were sort of processing some of those beautiful and horrible things that we kind of walked through together and in the aftermath. And we were talking about this whole the recent stuff with Paul Pressler that had come out, which is really, really, really nefarious. And the leaders like Al Mohler, all these people knew for years and just covered it up. These boys that you could fill a Sunday school room with that he abused. And it's just really disgusting. And I mean, I'm so glad the Department of Justice is investigating the SBC, because leaders have not done their job. This bro club has really covered for each other. at the expense of boys and girls and women and men who've been abused for so long. But as we were kind of unpacking that, I was like, how common is it to know, like, or have at least been at conferences and known this many predators who are pastors? Like, right. It shouldn't be common. And yet somehow, because of my experience, being Southern Baptist all these years in ministry, like I know more people than I should know. I feel like I don't know what the statistics should be of how many people that you should know that are predators and pastors, but I just know enough to where I am like, this is a word, Preda-Pastor. Like it's a horrible thing to have to make up, but I think when you give language to it, it helps people see. And that was the point of it for me.
Yeah. And they use language to craft a narrative, and you're like showing, here's the language that like counters the narrative. And, if you look at just sociology, the thing that binds people together is like an agreed upon mythology, and not mythology as in like a false story, but like the story that gives meaning to our existence. And they're strong stories. If you look at the mythologies, of any people, those are the things that gave them meaning. This is where we come from. This is what we're about, and this is where we're going. And there's been, in modern times, there's like a loss of a common mythology. So it feels almost like these small subcultures that we call churches, like they're just tasked to make a mythology that everyone can adhere to, agree to, and believe together. And then you have to protect that at all costs. And it has like this culty feel to it that like I alone here am crafting the narrative that we are all going to adhere to. And it seems to be just like falling apart now, where there's all of these stories coming out and saying, well, this mythology, this narrative where, women are suppressed and abused and made small is, now there's stories about how harmful that is. And it used to just be, quote unquote theology that we all believed in. And now it's like, wait, that's just a narrative that we held to that somebody constructed. And like, yeah, these are harmful stories. And I think that your top 10 things, like these are what Preda-Pastors say. And in the community, it's almost like the narrative they're trying to weave about who they are and who we are, but it's very much tied to their ego.
The way this sort of list came up for me is last week was a pretty hard week. And I'm not going to give all the details yet because it's very, very fresh for me. But I found out that somebody that I know and that was a part of my, influence and spiritual formation, along with many, many other people, right? But that this person was arrested on Monday on 35 counts of sexual assault of minors. And this person held a pretty high position other than the pastoral position they held. And, my memories of that faith environment are largely just beautiful. I think as a child, you don't always see everything. And so, talking to people who were adults around that situation who are no longer part of that faith community, they saw some things that as a child I didn't see, of course, right? And so it's something I'm still processing, but I reached out to a person in that faith community just to see how they're doing. And they left me a voicemail, and the list I wrote on Twitter is everything they said, like verbatim.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But it shocked me so much because I've heard those things in so many other environments. I've heard them throughout these last 3 years from Echo Church and people I'm still connected with there, from people, now at Saddleback, now that's somehow a part of my story because my abuser now is the lead pastor there. And because our abuse is also involved with how the elders didn't handle that situation well, where many of us spoke out about our stories, at least 20 people that we know of, and they covered it all up. Right. So I've heard these stories. I have people that come to me because Jason and I went public with our story on the record once Andy Wood was hired at Saddleback, just to say we can't be silent about this. We really need it to be more public because of how big his position is, how influential it is to be the lead pastor at Saddleback, which is a church that, Rick Warren prayed over the president, Obama, and everything. And so there's just a lot of influence there. And we just felt like being silent was something we couldn't keep on our conscience for ourselves. But because I've been public with my story, I get a lot of stories from other people, both from my abuser in places he worked before, like in Texas. He was in college in South Carolina. I even met people that knew him in high school. Like, they've come up and told me their stories about him, which are typically not good. But I also hear some of these same things in my list about Preda-Pastors that I put on Twitter. But I think I was really shocked last week to hear those from this particular faith environment, because my experience in it had been so beautiful, and to just see, wow, this playbook is so strong, so strong, that's just the knee-jerk reaction, that this congregation really had been groomed over time, that as soon as he was arrested, they're saying the same things I'm hearing so many other places. And that's been really hard for me. I think so part of it is my experience, at least on Twitter, a lot of it is just a way to express what I'm feeling, that I know other people are feeling, and I don't want people to feel alone, because I felt alone at times in this.
Do you mind if we go through some, and then you can offer the Google Translate?
Let's go through it. Yep.
All right. Jason, you can pipe in also. I know you didn't write this, but you're there, and I want your thoughts too, my friend.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate that, Tom. You're a good man. I don't care what Lori says about you. I think you're great, man. Including
the men. We need equity for the men. Yes, good for you.
Yeah. People just don't know how hard it is to be a white man these days. It's so hard. So much oppression and persecution.
Oh, we'll see if that makes the cut. All right. So one of the things that when a pastor is caught in abuse, or they're in trouble with the law, or something, one of the things that the community ends up saying is, we are praying for the pastor. I mean, on the surface, that sounds like an innocent statement. That's something we ought to be doing, but often it means something else. So could you, both of you, can you Google Translate that for us? What are they actually saying and meaning?
So, yeah, I mean, the list starts with, basically just defending the pastor. I think that overall, if I could sum up in a particular phrase, what often happens in the wake of these abuse allegations coming out, whether they're crimes or just very immoral things, like spiritual abuse would be in that category of unethical, immoral, but not necessarily illegal. Although there are parts of it that can be. And in the knee-jerk reaction, what I often see is centering the abuser and decentering the victim survivors. And so that initial phrase is usually going to give you an idea of where it goes. In fact, in this voice message, never once was any of his victims mentioned. Everything was about the pastor, the Preda-Pastor. So yeah, the initial defense of we're praying for him. It's centering him. It's the empathy, that word that we use that means give empathy to the man who's done the abuse, and just have no empathy for all the people picking up the pieces of their lives that he's done crimes against, right? So that initial phrase kind of sets the foundation. Like you mentioned, the story, the mythology, the stories we tell ourselves are powerful. Jason mentioned some stories that our colleagues were telling themselves. We're in the same organization, and we have very different stories about conservative takeover, conservative resurgence. We had very different stories about what it meant to be a woman in ministry, like all those things. But this particular story, and I would say a lot of, pastors that are predatory tend to really harp on the origin story of the church and them being at the center of it. I see this out of Saddleback, even pre Andy Wood being there. And it was definitely a part of Echo Church. You're constantly telling the origin story, and it includes them at the center. So it does kind of groom the congregation to continue to center that abuser, even when he gets arrested for crimes.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would really add to that is I think when I hear that now, when there's been accusations and when they just kind of say, hey, let's just pray, keep praying for the pastor, we're praying for the pastor, all of that. I think what it's really is trying to do is it's trying to keep people from being curious, keep people from asking questions, stay loyal. Let's keep this in the spiritual realm over here and just keep taking it to God, because only God's the one that can really deal with all of this. And so I think a lot of it's that phrase is meant to make people feel, if they're feeling worried and concerned, it's like, oh yeah, we're just supposed to take this to God. We're not supposed to actually do anything about it or question it. And so it kind of silences the whole, people coming up to them and saying, and trying to get the details and trying to make sure like what it really happened. Or should we be concerned about our kids, or should we be concerned about someone else that's on staff? Whatever that is, it's actually meant to silence, in my opinion.
Yeah. It centers that pastor as the focal point and receiving all compassion and empathy, and then silences and excludes the victims. And then it's almost like upholding that narrative that we are this church and this is the leader that has carried us through or built us, and he's at the center. And then when you don't believe that narrative anymore, you are on the outside of that, and that is a very lonely place to be, because everybody's still looking forward towards the center. When you're on the edge, you're like, I'm really far from the center now. And it's only when in social media, when you can like turn your head to the left and the right and say, wait, there's other people out here, and we can hear their stories. So I really appreciate just that picture that you painted about that. We're praying for the pastor. Well, sounds really nice to say that, but here's what it's actually. I love your Google Translate. That was a good one. So then you said there are people out to get him. Like that one does, all of a sudden you go from we're praying for him to all of a sudden you've jumped into a big conspiracy and there's people out to get him. Why? What's going on in this statement here?
Yeah. I heard this. I remember vividly when #MeToo began and the #church movement was right on the coattails, soon to follow. And thank God for Twitter, right? Thank God. Twitter is horrible and beautiful once again. But it allowed women to have a voice, and especially these very complementarian spaces, especially the hierarchical complementarian spaces where they had no voice. And so a lot came out about one of the peepees, Paige Patterson, who was at Southwestern Seminary at the time and had covered up a lot of sexual assaults, both there and at Southeastern Seminary where he had been. And some of the, stories started to come out. And I remember we were on like our stateside assignment, which was like a furlough time in Cupertino when that came out. And I was like, there was a petition, and I said, I want to sign it. I don't know if it means I'll be fired from my organization, because it was one of those things. There weren't written rules about what you could and couldn't do in a situation like that, because that was so new. But it definitely felt like this is something that could end up, because I'm being so public with my name on a petition against the president of the largest seminary in the world, that could be something that would mean they don't want me to work with that organization anymore, right? That denomination. So, but Jason and I, we sort of discussed it, and it was like, no, this is the right thing to do. So we were some of the early signers that said, Paige Patterson really needs to be held accountable for this cover up of sexual assault of students, of seminary students, right? And so that ended up getting a lot of traction, and he did end up getting removed, a very kind of somewhat honorable discharge. I mean, they never let these guys just fully face the consequences, right? And now he has some new book out, which is, I don't know. But also like Bill Hybels, like he got $1 million to go away, and then he's still kind of, a lot of people don't believe even now at Willow Creek that he did anything wrong. So there's all that spin continues for a really long time. This whole people are out to get him. I remember hearing that from some friends of ours that, we worked with over in Indonesia, and they were like, well, Satan hates Paige. That was the phrase we would often hear. Now you hear that against Donald Trump. Satan hates Donald Trump. Like you'll hear that kind of stuff, but it's this narrative that basically draws a line in the sand, and which side are you on? It doesn't allow for any nuance at all, which is sort of the point in these sort of toxic systems. So you're either in or you're out, very culty. You're either on the side where God is with this man, or you're on the side that's like Satan, right? Satan's after him. And so in this context, with this specific thing that was said, it was in reference to the lawyer, the prosecutor that's prosecuting this Preda-Pastor for crimes against children, right? But the narrative is that there are people out to get him, that want to persecute pastors, that hate pastors, right? And I think lawyers, reporters often get put in those categories. My experience on this end of the last 3 years of what I've walked through in the aftermath of all the abuse at Echo Church and the cover up at Saddleback Church is lawyers and reporters have been doing some of the best work of justice and are on God's side of truth and transparency. And I thank God for the Department of Justice in the United States. I have hope that they will actually bring some truth and transparency into this horrible situation. I'm grateful for reporters like Robert Downen, who exposed the SBC and the Houston Chronicle back when we were still living in Singapore in our last few months with that whole situation. And then, others like Julie Roys that, carefully reported our story. I think that often reporters and lawyers get put in that category of people who are against pastors, but it is a way to shut down the narrative. It is a way to get people to only listen to that origin story of where this Preda-Pastor is at the center and not listen to the whistleblowers who are risking everything, their reputation, sometimes their job, their livelihood, their friendships, their faith community, to say the thing no one wants to say. And it takes a lot of courage. And so instead of giving them support to tell us these prophetic truths that would be good for us, they end up saying things like, people are out to get the pastor. And it is such an easy sell in those environments because of that thing our brains do with that cognitive dissonance where we want to think about the happy thing. We want to revert to our good experiences with that man. And there always are good experiences. This man that, this Twitter thread led to, I have good experiences with him. I have good experiences with Andy Wood and Felipe Santos, who badly abused me and put a nuclear bomb in our family, basically, spiritually speaking. But if we didn't have those good experiences, we would never stay. And that's why this narrative works. There's people out to get him. Satan hates Paige. Satan hates this Preda-Pastor, that narrative.
Yeah, no, I think that was good. I mean, there's so much around. People are out to get him. It just suddenly puts everybody else on the defensive for that person, and that therefore don't question. Again, it's part of that silencing too, I think. Yep.
And this one kind of goes hand in hand with it, where the accuser is trying to build their career. So people are out to get him, and now this person that is like a victim, they'll never use that language. They're going to use accuser. They're trying to build their career. Is that a common phrase that you hear?
That's been said about me. There could be people listening to this podcast who have heard that about me. It's definitely more toward women, I would say. It's because of once again, the stories we tell ourselves, which a lot of them are sexist or racist in nature, right? Or have, prefer people of a certain socioeconomic class over others. When all of those narratives we tell ourselves mean that when a narrative that matches it comes close to it, we just automatically believe it. And that's how our brains work. So any of those sexist narratives that women are after their sugar daddy, or women are, always trying to build their career by taking a good man down. A lot of that was said about, Paige Patterson as well. Trying to bring a good man down. So that's, certainly been said about me. I see it said about a lot of women in the evangelical community that are whistleblowers about their own abuse or about other people or even advocates of the abuse community. It's pretty easy sell against a woman. This case where this Twitter thread came from, it was in reference to the female prosecuting lawyer that she's trying to build her law career by taking down a prominent pastor. like that would be, I don't even understand it, but it's so easy. I mean, they believe it. Like the person that told me is a woman and she fully believes it. But I think it is a narrative that I hear pretty commonly because it gives the thing that's being done in these scenarios is they are trying to flip the script. They're Dr. Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer talk about that quite a bit in a church called Tove. But the flipping the script is if you can give any shadow of a doubt that the accuser, the whistleblower, has any nefarious or alternative motive, it automatically means that people won't want to listen to that person. And in a world that silences women in general, or at least mildly, it could be a faux egalitarian space or a complementarian space. It's just typically they're not listening to women anyway. So this is just a really easy way to shut down anything that she's saying by saying she's trying to build her career or she's greedy. She wants his pulpit. And that was said about me from Andy Wood, which was never true. But yeah, just the whole giving people a reason to think, well, I can't believe a word this person says, by putting one phrase, one word to discredit their intention and their motives.
Yeah, that career thing. I mean, I think it can be a lot of different stuff. I think for us, the big one was, oh, we're doing this for money. Like we were trying to get more money from the church, which is just, anybody that knew us, it's so laughable because it's like, yeah, that whole 20 years as missionaries, the whole 10 years in a remote place in Indonesia, we've just always been about that money, I'm just like, it's like so ironic. And even in the process of like, when they were like saying to get our severance, they were offering us 2.5 months severance if we signed the NDA, and we were refusing to. One of the last things we said is like, look, we really thought there's no way they're gonna give us a document that we can sign, because we were having lawyers look over it and stuff, right? But we even told them, we said, look, you guys, you're offering us 2.5 months severance, and if it's an issue of finances, that you can't do an external, a legit investigation like with someone like Grace Ministries, as well as the counseling that we're saying needs to really happen for Andy and Felipe, then use our severance for that. Like, we're not going to get it anyway because I can't imagine you're going to sign. So it was like, how are we in this for fine? We really did think, I don't know how we're going to make it, but I can't, and then for them to go around saying we were demanding a year's severance, which was never said, never even thought of. At one point, Felipe had asked me, what do you think you need to help you get to the next thing? I said, well, I mean, if, with all that's blowing up in our life and the counseling that's going to happen for us and our kids, and try to figure out what we're going to do next. I mean, having a 6 months transition it seems like that would be really helpful. And that's where he started to get mad, and then later built it up that I was demanding a year's severance. But anyway, yeah, it puts all the questioning of the motives of the person who is actually trying to do the right thing is what that does. Is it just puts all of their motives in question, and so they can't be trusted.
It like attacks the character of that individual, saying the things about the man whose character is obviously not good.
Yeah, and to add to that, I was called a monster in a text by a good friend at Echo Church, who ceased to be a friend at that point.
I see why.
Yeah. And Jezebel was, so that's a common one, right? Trying to chop off men's heads apparently is what I was trying to do. So, right. They have to paint whistleblowers in this way to discredit the whistleblowers, which once again, and Dr. Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer go into great detail in their book, A Church Called Tove, is how to discredit the whistleblowers. It is part of the playbook.
You're helping us see this playbook because that everyone's trying to keep that narrative intact, because that's what holds the people together. And then there's one man at the center who's like responsible for it. And
yeah, I think it's also, if your metrics that you're looking for, that you only care about is how much money's coming in, how many butts are in seats, how many people are saying, yes to Jesus, how many people are agreeing to be baptized, like it's those metrics. Well, when something like this happens, you're so terrified of it affecting those metrics. Mm-hmm. So it's all about the image management. It's not about truth. It's not about caring for people well. It's about making sure it doesn't affect this business that's been created And so, all these taxes are being used to protect the image and protect those metrics. So it keeps going up because you can't ever take a dip. Because if you take a dip going down, then that looks like you're not doing well.
Right.
I mean, they would fudge numbers all the time to make it look like it's always growing. Even in COVID, in that year, they showed growth. Anyway.
Yeah, it seems like we spiritualize those numbers too. It's not just butts in the seats, but it's, church involvement, or it's not baptisms, it's like these are conversions, and it's not just finances, but this is God's blessing and favor coming upon us. And we take these metrics from the business world, apply it to the church, and then spiritualize it, and then all of a sudden wrap a powerful mythology around it, and then all of a sudden it becomes really foggy and sticky at the same time. It's like, oh yeah, you start questioning the narrative, you start questioning the motive of anything within that system, and all of a sudden you are now the threat and pushed to the outside into liminal spaces.
Well, and I'm pretty sure God doesn't like their name to be used to build something for yourself and finances, right? And you're kind of like, you're using Jesus as a commodity to gain something for yourself in a business, and you're like, woo! Mm-hmm. I think that's some sick stuff. Once you start to get into that sort of realm, and once your eyes are open, you're seeing what's really happening. You're like, man, that's where you're like, I don't think this needs to exist anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people are like, oh, how could you say that? It's a church. Nah, it's a business.
So you kind of switch gears here. It goes from like upholding the pastor and denying anything's gone wrong to then like, well, who hasn't sinned, and we shouldn't judge, and we need to be unified on this. Like, it almost contradicts the first part of what they were saying to then go into defending the person's wrongdoings that at first they were denying. But you're saying this is in one voicemail. So how do they jump from denying to defending, and why?
Yeah, they're taking you on the journey they've been taken on.
Ooh.
And this is a very common thing. I mean, I've been on this journey with so many people, and that same conversation I feel like I've had so many times in both Echo Church Saddleback situations, and then in other ones that have now come to me, Southern Baptist stuff in general, where there's a lot of, people defending their hero that they worship. They really want a savior, and they want this person to strongly lead them spiritually with this authority. And they can't imagine a scenario where they're not somehow perfect. But I will say there's some theological elements that I think play into this, and some things that you've probably heard too that are really disturbing. And it's basically I think a very bad interpretation of King David and what happened with him. You hear a lot of times in evangelical circles, he was a man after God's own heart. He was God's man. Those things are said about Donald Trump, which makes me want to literally vomit, because he has sexually assaulted multiple women. Recently had to pay $85 million because not only did he sexually assault that woman, but he also, is saying terrible, untruthful things about her. But somehow he's still God's man in people's eyes, right? And so, but I think that when people interpret the David raping Bathsheba and murdering her husband's story as, well, he's God's man, he's a man after God's own heart, he, quote, I'm using air quotes here, sinned. It's like, okay, sin and crimes are completely different things. Do they overlap? Is there a Venn diagram? Of course. But when all you use is the phrase sin about crimes such as murder and sexual assault, we have a real theological problem here. When you just say, oh, well, all was forgiven, God forgave David, he really was remorseful. You'll even have some of these Preda-Pastors cry on occasion, or do a faux apology, I call it, which is just not a real apology. It's like, I'm sorry for how I made you feel or whatever. Which, you can look up in the Twitter threads that Andy Wood did that back right after he went to Saddleback, when everybody was upset about him having Mark Driscoll at the church right after he fired us. He brought him in to speak about healthy leaders and healthy teams. And you can't even make this stuff up, right? But yeah, this whole narrative of taking you from, we should pray for him, people are to get him, and then it's like, well, they somehow have to acknowledge the thing in our brains, which is like, I think these allegations might be true, and so they take you there on the journey. Then it's just this quick, cheap grace, forgiveness, forgive and forget and move on. While I find it very ironic that a lot of the whistleblowers, the abuse victim survivors, forgiveness is weaponized against them, because they're being told, well, you must just be bitter because you won't let this go. Why are you still talking about this? But if you keep these crimes in the category of sin and forgiveness only, we have a theological problem, because a lot of evangelicalism would want to say all sins are the same, while at the same time saying, but then other ones are worse. And those would be things like, some that would say homosexuality is a sin. Well, that in some people's evangelical world is worse, but somehow sexual assault and murder isn't. Like, there's so many double standards. But when they're taking you on this journey, once again, they're just still centering this man who's a savior, who's a hero. The whole institution revolves around him. The institution cannot sustain itself in the same way without him at the center, even if he's leading the church from jail, which has happened apparently. And the institution, I have an undergrad in sociology, and I understand that institutions protect themselves. So when the church gets institutionalized, even if it's a house church, that can happen, right? It wants to protect itself, and there will be narratives that are spread around in order to continue to protect the person who started it, which is why having one person at the center is dangerous, and centering them in this way at all costs, I do think has a lot to do with how people interpret that story of David, and just excuse him and excuse Donald Trump and excuse these Preda-Pastors. Like, you see the same pattern over and over again.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I love how you distinguish sins and crimes, and how I've been on this kick about finding the things that we spiritualize so that we can diminish them or put them away, and taking the word crimes and spiritualizing it into sins so that we can then just dismiss it in this act of cheap grace and cheap forgiveness, false forgiveness. I have not thought about that. I think I'm going to be thinking about that a while. It lands in this, like, we need to change our judgmental thinking. And then, God is, at the end, God is the one who can judge. And it sounds like grace only travels in one direction with these people. And it's towards the center, towards the leader, towards the man. And there is no grace for those that are being run over by the bus or excluded or thrown to the edges. Why is it? I mean, I think we've hit on this, but I'll ask the question again. Maybe we can come at it from a different angle, but why in a faith that emphasizes grace are we only aiming that towards the center, towards the hierarchy, towards the man, towards the pastor, and not towards those who have been hurt and wounded? Why is grace such a scarce commodity in the church in this realm?
Well, I think when people start to tie their spiritual experience to a personality, to start to question whether or not that person can be trusted, it's terrifying. I mean, it has to be. I mean, I've not experienced that, because typically my faith's never been tied to a specific person. But when you're in a church environment where so much is centered around this man, it's so tied to that, right? I mean, and so when if they can give grace to him, then that's right. He's not Jesus. Oh, that's right. He's not perfect. Oh, okay. So all this experience that I've had with him, and all the experiences that he's helped me have with, God, is all still legit, because, he's just a human after all. And so then it's like, so then it should, again, it just, like you said it perfectly. The grace doesn't go towards the accusers. In fact, accusers have to actually live up to the highest possible standard in order to be believed. Because if in the story, if they say one thing off, this is why when whistleblowers are trying to share something, they're so paranoid. Sometimes you'll hear them. I know I was doing this nonstop. Wait, no, it wasn't 2, it was 3. No, it wasn't this, it was that. Like, I'm trying to be so like, oh my gosh, am I remembering this little detail wrong? Because if someone goes and finds out I shared this detail and it's a little bit off, they're going to go, oh, see, can't trust anything they said. But it's not the same for the pastor, the Preda-Pastor, because that Preda-Pastor is the one that's been the one helping facilitate their experience with God. And so they can be given a lot more than the accusers, for sure.
Wow. Yeah. That fear that you touch on, it's almost like their whole spiritual identity is like anchored to that person and the narrative that they're telling. And they're afraid of who they would be without that, or if that even is questioned a little bit. And that fear then causes them to go on this illogical rant. I mean, the things that you list in this Twitter post are absolutely illogical. They don't make sense. But to somebody who is, swimming and drowning in this narrative, it makes perfect sense. You guys have been through so much, and what brings you hope right now? What is bringing you, like, in this world where there's a lot of things going around, what is bringing you hope?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of beauty in the ashes of the abuse community, victim survivors. I find a lot of beauty there. People who have had their lives just obliterated spiritually by these Preda-Pastors and are picking up the pieces of their lives still, are still having horrible things said about many of them along the lines of this list we shared, that they are these accusers trying to build their careers based off this or whatever. But somehow there's this very sacred community of these victim survivors that have just been a place where the Holy Spirit dwells in a very special way. God's heart beats towards justice. God is always on the side of the oppressed. And there's something really beautiful about that community that we fell into because of what happened to us very suddenly. And I, having been Southern Baptist for so long, having read things like the articles in the Houston Chronicle by Robert Downen, having known, some missionary kids who had been abused by IMB missionaries, having known, a few people here and there who had abuse in their churches. It really was not something I understood until it happened to me. There's just a level of, it's so unimaginable. Really, it's hard to comprehend it fully until you've experienced anything like it or walked very closely with someone in the aftermath of it. But I would say I have a lot of hope for those who continue to still speak out for years and years. I think of people like Krista Brown and the SBC, who's just been speaking for years and years, and Deanne Miller's another one. That I don't know how they sustain it, honestly. But it is a beautiful work of justice. And I think that, if some of the narratives and the stories in our SBC time around what the gospel is, often really left off the justice aspect of it. But I find a lot of hope and beauty in making wrongs right. Even from doing an actual apology instead of a faux apology. Like, you'll never, fix years of damage that you've done to people, but there is an aspect of justice that involves just the most simple and basic of things, of truly humbling yourself to say, what I did was wrong. How can I make this right? And the fact that, so many of these Preda-Pastors just seem to be incapable of that. I don't see any hope there. And so I don't spend a lot of my time In fact, I have a lot of lack of hope about whether people can actually change in those situations over the last 3 years and what I've walked through and understanding a lot about the narcissism spectrum and that kind of thing. It doesn't mean I don't have compassion for it, but it just means I don't put a lot of my efforts toward trying to change the people who are, the Preda-Pastors. It's not a particular area where I find hope, but I do find hope in the whistleblowers, the victim survivors who are continuing to warn about, people who are preying upon vulnerable people. And it's not only just vulnerable, like I'm friends with, like Nancy Ortberg, for example. She's a very strong woman. If you've ever been around her, she's smart, she's knowledgeable, she's a strong leader. And for her to be a victim survivor of Bill Hybels just shows that it's not always these, shy, disenfranchised people that people don't notice. It's often really strong people that get preyed upon. And so I think that in the victim survivor community, it's not a monolith. There's a lot of diversity there. And I do see a lot of hope in the ways that people still bring about change. I think if you ever hear me stop talking about this abuse in the church, then you'll be able to know that I've probably lost hope and change. But for now, I still have some.
Yeah, I just second everything, Lori just said. One thing I would add that's just in my own personal experience right now, I'm a part of with a spiritual director in St. Ignatius exercises, going through with a small group, going through that over several months of time. And it's had a significant impact for me and my faith, even transitioning how I recognize the voice of God as the one that calls me beloved. I think for decades, I have claimed God's voice as things that weren't really from God, that they were voices of shame, voices of guilt and fear. But that gives me a lot of hope in my faith in this journey of unpacking all of that, and that being in this part of this experience has been very different in the way the approach to scripture, the approach to hearing God and responding, the approach to slowing down. Earlier, I think before recording, you were talking about the liminal space. I was like, I hate liminal space. And I've been in it for a while now. And this year, in the beginning of this year, I really felt it like, oh my gosh, I was hoping this was going to be the year of kind of coming out of that liminal space. And instead I'm actually I'm choosing that actually there's just so much more work to be done, in me around this and unpacking and being able to sit with that and being able to stay in this liminal space so it really can do the work that's needed, really. And, as Jesus says in Mark 8 or 9, I think, he says something along the lines with, after these disciples have been debating about who's the best. And he's like, if you want to follow me, let me lead. If you want, self-sacrifice is what leads to your true self. And embrace suffering. Don't avoid it. Man, trying to learn those things it's freaking hard, man. But I think it's worth it. And that gives me hope that I actually am still in my own heart and in my own mind, still leaning deeper into that as opposed to running from it and just trying to escape from it.
I think those are some beautiful thoughts. Thank you. Thank you for being so open and courageous with this issue. It's, I think it is unraveling a lot of things, and it's nice to know that someone who's been pulling on those threads, I think you're going to do something good, rebuilding and doing something more true, something a little more democratic, to use a political word, but based upon communities and peoples and neighborhoods, and not shining light leaders that can't be questioned. So my last question is, how can people connect with what you're saying and what you're doing? Where would you point them?
Yeah, I have a podcast called A World of Difference. I started it back when I was on staff at Echo Church, oddly enough. But it has been this place where I really enjoy learning as well. Like you, podcasting for me is a space where I can interview authors of books I've read and ask them the questions I've asked them, or basically I bring difference makers around the table to bring our differences together to make a difference together. So we talk about our differences. I think that there's a lot of different ways to live this human life, and having been raised overseas and lived most of my life abroad, and having studied, 6 languages, I'm really different because of the people I speak with and people I've known, the languages that people have taught me. It's given me this, beautiful diversity in my own experience. And I just want more. And that's part of why I podcast. So I'd love for people to join me there at A World of Difference podcast. Also, you can find me on my website, loriadamsbrown.com. If you're still in X Twitter world, I'm Lori ADBR, where you can find that Preda-Pastor thread. But yeah, and I'm on Instagram at Lori Adams Brown.
All right. Well, I'll make sure to post those in the notes.
Nice. Yeah, I'm on all those social media stuff too, but I don't post nearly as much as Lori does. But that is one way to connect with me. Some of the things that I'm also doing is I've been meeting with some people who have been hurt in the church, and I have a background in marriage and family therapy and trauma specialist, all that kind of stuff. And so if that's part of someone's journey and they're wanting someone to walk through that with them, there's a possibility there also. And they can just email me directly at jasonadamsbrown73@gmail.com.
Should put that in the notes as well. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking with me, teaching me some stuff and sharing your story.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom. It's been an honor to be with you today. And I just wish all of your listeners who listen to this podcast a deep breath and a grounding moment for themselves to just kind of notice how you're feeling, because some of these things can be really heavy. So yeah, I hope that people take care of themselves, because this can bring up a lot for people. But once again, Jason is one of those people that can really help people walk through it. So please reach out to him if that's the case for you.
Well, thank you for listening to the Liminal Living podcast. I hope that you found this conversation helpful. I hope that it was a light in dark places for you if you're in a dark place. I hope that it was a little pin on a map if you're lost in the deserts of deconstruction and you're not sure which way is up or down or east or west. And that's what we're trying to do, is rally people around, give you conversations that are helpful, that give you perspective on where you're at, let you know you're not alone. So next week we have a wonderful, fun conversation with Dr. David Fitch, I believe is who's up next on the pod. He wrote a great book called Reckoning with Power that really is going to complement this episode here today. So stick around for that one next week, and we'll see you then. Peace out.